Baggis needs no introduction. He's a great friend of our seminar, a perennial favorite, our local patristic scholar. And Mario, I'm going to attempt to pronounce the title of your paper, and then I'll hand it over to you to correct me and, and convince. So this paper, I think, is called The Symbolic World of Göbekli Tepe and the First Cities in Eliadean Approach.
Eliadean, yeah. Eliadean. Eliade, after Mircea Eliade, the great Romanian historian of religions in the mid 20th century. He died, I think, in the 1980s. Thank you. I miss St. Mark's. I'm grateful to pop in from time to time. You've inherited the better Bagos with Chris, and he keeps singing your praises, and he's enjoying his time. So that's and he's teaching with you, so that's wonderful. My topic on the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe is admittedly very bizarre. It's the kind of thing that you might find in one of those Usborne mysteries of the past books that you'd pick up in your, school library in high school or something like that. It sounds a bit like that. But I can make an argument for how it fits in to these seminars, or at least I'll try. In 2021, I published this book, shameless self-promotion here, From the Ancient Near East to Christian Byzantium, where I tried to account for religious symbolisms in ancient cities, ancient and medieval cities, diachronically and cross-culturally, using Mircea Eliade's conceptual categories of imago mundi, image of the world, and axis mundi, center of the world, whereby he interpreted ancient temples, palaces, and eventually churches as recapitulating the various levels of the cosmos as experienced and perceived by the inhabitants of those cities. It's very obvious in ancient Egyptian temples, for example, that they recapitulate the Nile and their conception of the heavenly space. It's very obvious later on in the earliest Christian churches that you have Christ at the center of the dome representing the cosmos, and so on and so forth. Even the vertical orientation of monuments, megalithic stone pillars, was seen as intersecting heaven and earth. So the book tried to account for the similarities and differences between ancient pagan civilizations and Christian civilization. The similarities I've mentioned, the differences are that with the advent of Christendom, whilst authoritarianism in government was not removed entirely, you have emperors and empresses and kings and queens, nevertheless, they were subordinated to Christ, who in the art and architecture of medieval Christian churches in the East and West, specifically in Byzantium, which is what I focused on in my book, Christ is at the center of the dome, and so on and so forth, as I mentioned. Then last year, I think it was, I was thinking about a possible coda or a postscript to the book in relation to what happens with the emergence of the modern city in the Enlightenment period, with the marginalization of religion in the public space and the substitution of religious conceptions of the world with neoclassicism and the cult of the soldier, the civil religion, and so on and so forth, and how those phenomena, which can be discerned in cities like Washington, D.C., New York, and various others, were completely, let's say, eradicated by industrialization. And so what we're left with are very functional and utilitarian megalopolis, large cities with skyscrapers at their center, reflecting our very let's say, commercial and capitalist worldview, and somehow having a detrimental effect on our well-being from various perspectives. I presented that to you all last year, I think it was, and that's a closed bracket, if you like, to what I was trying to map out in my book. This topic, which I'm going to read out to you today on the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe, is like an open bracket, because whilst I began my book with the earliest cities that emerged in Mesopotamia around just over 5,000 years ago, Eridu and Ur, these were the first large temple cities that we have evidence for in the archaeological record. they're swiftly followed by Egyptian cities and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, I wanted to go further back in the historical, let's say, continuum and look at the possibility for religious symbolism before the agrarian revolution, which took place around about 7,000 years ago, 5,000 BC, with the emergence of the first urban towns and settlements. Why did I want to do that? Because I just wanted to see whether or not religion or religious perceptions of the world are an impetus for civilization, as argued by Eliade, Karen Armstrong, and so many other anthropologists and historians of religion in the 20th century, Claude Levi-Strauss. If you look at it psychologically, you can go to Carl Jung and so on and so forth. They all address these things, Joseph Campbell. And Göbekli Tepe is a site which is about 10,000 years old in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, the southeastern part of modern-day Turkey, which emerges at the end of the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer period, and it pretty much curtailed the impression that secular anthropologists and archaeologists had in the mid to late 20th century that religion emerged after the establishment of the first cities as a form of social cohesion. This site, as we'll see, was built by hunter-gatherers without any urban settlement in sight, and it's a religious site. Why did they build it? That's the question that I'm going to ask in this presentation. So I'll just share my. Is it possible that I can screen share? Sorry about that, Amy. Oh, great, fantastic. Okay, let me just open this up. Okay, so the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe in the first cities and Eliadean approach. Obviously, I'm applying the conceptual categories of Imago Mundi and Axis Mundi yet again. So here's a bit of a preamble. First noted in geographical surveys in 1964, Göbekli Tepe, an archaeological site situated about 15 kilometers northeast of the Turkish city of Şanlıurfa, was made famous in the 1990s by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt. From 1995 until his death in 2014, Schmidt argued for the religious significance of this site. Mircea Eliade, the great 20th century historian of religions, passed away in 1986, many years before Schmidt published his findings on Göbekli Tepe. Nevertheless, Eliade's heuristic devices of Axis Mundi, center of the world, and Imago Mundi, image of the world, can help us make sense of the symbolic significance of Göbekli Tepe, a significance that demonstrates that religion, expressed through a variety of symbols, is a necessary precursor to civilization, to the first cities. And at the end, I'll kind of hit at an inference from this that makes religion, in its positive aspects or pathological aspects as well, but religion as fundamental to the proper ordering and function of the civic space, although that's something that's not acknowledged in the modern city. And perhaps it's something that factors into the modern city in another way, a kind of idolization of greed and money and so on and so forth, but we'll talk about that later. These themes will be addressed below. Firstly, I will define symbolism and its role in Göbekli Tepe as a precursor to urban settlement. Second, I will explain how the anteriority of religion to urban settlement, or the civic enterprise in general, by way of inference, exhibits that religion, expressed through symbols, is a necessary precursor and condition for the first cities in the Near East and Mediterranean. And here's an aerial view of the excavation site of Göbekli Tepe. You can see the four main sites there towards the bottom, which are circular, let's say, spaces that are punctuated by megalithic limestone pillars, and we'll talk about them soon. So let's define symbolism before we address the site. Eliade famously averred that archaic, so between 8,000 to 500 BC, quite a broad span of time, man, a non-inclusive language, I apologize, that he was writing in the mid-20th century. So is fundamentally homo religiosus, which translates roughly into the religious man or person, or man as inherently religious, homo religiosus. David Doran's translation of the following passage in the Romanian edition of Eliade's Patterns of Comparative Religion is relevant for this point. The main religious stance of human beings had been given once and for all since the moment human beings, became conscious of their existential situation inside the universe. For Eliade, the birth of human consciousness was marked by religiosity. This has been reiterated by Karen Armstrong, who affirmed that men and women started worshipping gods as soon as they became recognizably human. So worship, reaching it from, beyond the self to a greater awareness of God and the world, is something that constitutes human consciousness at the very beginning. This cannot be empirically demonstrated from, let's say, archaeological evidence, but it's something that can be inferred back based on the abundant religious-like archaeological evidence that is extant. Indeed, in her short history of myth, Armstrong began her discussion with Neanderthal graves from the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age, broadly speaking from 30,000 to 10,000 BC, so another broad sweep of time, that displayed an interest in ideas that went beyond everyday experience, the sorts of items that these Neanderthal persons were buried with, and the symbolic or ritualistic arrangement of those items, so on and so forth. The construction of Göbekli Tepe, marked by hunter-gathering, falls within this period at the end of the Old Stone Age, so 10,000 BC, around then. The construction, we shall thus presuppose that religious ideas continued, even as an impetus for human settlement, especially in the consecutive epoch, which is called the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age. And that's a shorter period from 10,000 to 8,000 BC. Armstrong continued that although today we separate the religious from the secular, this would have been incomprehensible to the Paleolithic hunters, for whom nothing was profane. Everything they saw or experienced was transparent to its counterpart in the divine world. The most ordinary actions were ceremonies that enabled mortal beings to participate in the timeless world of everywhere, beyond the unfolding of time and space. For us moderns, a symbol is essentially separate from the unseen reality to which it directs our attention. But the Greek symbolin means to throw together. Two hitherto disparate objects become inseparable. When you contemplated any earthly object, you were therefore in the presence of its heavenly counterpart. Armstrong, who referred to Eliade often in her book, betrays her indebtedness to him here, first in relation to symbols, which according to him respond to a need and fulfill a function, that of bringing to light the most hidden modalities of being. In other words, these hidden modalities are expressed through symbols, which connect and facilitate participation in heretofore disparate aspects of reality, as denoted by the etymology of symbolin outlined above. Paul Ricoeur shed light on the meaning of symbolism, which is connected to its etymology, when he stated that the symbol consists of any structure of signification in which a direct, primary, literal meaning designates, in addition, another meaning which is indirect, secondary, and figurative, and which can be apprehended only through the first. For Eliade, it was these figurative meanings that reflected the deepest aspects of prehistoric humanity. For him, however, they were not indirect and secondary, as for Ricoeur, but came before language and discursive reason. This assessment, of course, is consistent with what we have seen so far, since the symbols of Göbekli Tepe certainly came before the written historical record, which began with cuneiform in Mesopotamia in the mid-4th millennium BC. So writing is only about 5,500 years old. As regards language, it is important to note that while hunter-gatherers did not have anything resembling historical forms of spoken human communication, that is a sort of communication reflected in the written record from 3500 BC onwards, they nevertheless communicated, they had their own language, we don't know what it was, through sounds, physical gestures, and symbols. Below, we shall see how this definition of symbolism, which conditioned human beings from the outset, can be applied to Göbekli Tepe, and in turn we shall demonstrate that religion, expressed through symbols, was a precursor to human settlement. So let's look at religion as a precursor to human settlement and cities, and the evidence from Göbekli Tepe. In his famous article published in 1950 entitled The Urban Revolution, archaeologist and philologist Vere Gordon Child asserted that before the Neolithic Age, which, as we mentioned, began around 8000 BC, and you know, these are movable dates here, between 10 to 8000 BC, scholars differ. The way of life of nomadic hunter-gatherers, marked by primitive technology, could not acquire, manage, and or facilitate the production of the necessary resources for settlements and growth. In the middle of the Neolithic Age, however, something dramatic took place. About 5,000 years ago, irrigation cultivation, combined with stock breeding and fishing in the valleys of the Nile in Egypt, the Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus, so we're looking at Mesopotamia, had begun to yield a social surplus large enough to support a number of resident specialists who were themselves released from food production. Water transport, supplemented in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley by wheeled vehicles and in Egypt by pack animals, made it easy to gather foodstuffs at a few centers. At the same time, dependence on river water for the irrigation of the crops restricted the cultivable areas, while the necessity of canalizing the waters and protecting habitations against annual floods encouraged the aggregation of population. Thus arose the first cities, units of settlement 10 times as great as any Neolithic village. The ability to irrigate one's own crops in a specific topography leads to a surplus of free hands that can then start becoming artisanal and building things and reflecting the perception of the universe in their art and so on and so forth. This is a utilitarian analysis of the first settlements, which grew as a result of the need to provide stable irrigation to crops that were being cultivated in a specific place by settlers, who, as a result of their resilience in breeding stock, fishing, and stockpiling food, had an abundant supply. It is an assessment that is not without merit. In fact, from what Child called a social surplus could be inferred the emergence of the first specialist artisans. This is what I just mentioned. Nevertheless, it was not within Child's purview to address the ideas or the beliefs that may have also impelled Neolithic humans to settle as groups or communities. Here are the T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe in the form of circles. There are 4 such circles that have been excavated since the 1960s. Scholars have searched for an answer to this question in the recent discoveries at Göbekli Tepe, which means navel hill in Turkish. So, omphalos, navel is in the navel of the body. A pre-pottery Neolithic tell, that is an archaeological mound created by human occupation or activity. This site has been excavated continuously since 1995 by the German Archaeological Institute and the Archaeological Museum in Sanliurfa, and consists of several sanctuaries in the form of round megalithic enclosures. About 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated, roughly 4 of the circular enclosures, with ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys, discovering many more, including what might be satellite sites. Charles C. Mann, a journalist for National Geographic who visited the site in 2011, described it aptly as follows. The site is vaguely reminiscent of Stonehenge, except that Göbekli Tepe was built much earlier, so Stonehenge is about 3000 BC, and is made not from roughly hewn blocks, but from cleanly carved limestone pillars ranging between 7 and 10 tons, the highest of which are 5.5 meters, splashed with bas reliefs of animals, a cavalcade of gazelles, snakes, foxes, scorpions, and ferocious wild boars. The assemblage was built some 11,600 years ago, several millennia before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It contains the oldest known temple. Indeed, Göbekli Tepe is the oldest known example of monumental architecture. The first structure human beings put together that was bigger and more complicated than a hut. When these pillars were erected, so far as we know, nothing of comparable scale existed in the world. And we need to underline the assertion so far as we know, because we've discovered this, there could be more sites to discover. Man went on to affirm that the site had caused much confusion for archaeologists, who once assumed, like Child, that the Neolithic Revolution was a single event, a sudden flash of genius that occurred 5,000 years ago in a single location, Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, then spread to India, Europe, and beyond. But since this discovery, researchers have had to admit that the Neolithic Revolution was a gradual process that occurred at various times and degrees in different places. What I would like to focus on is a more surprising discovery to come out of Göbekli Tepe. What was necessary for the Neolithic Revolution at 8000 BC, or any urban development, to take place are the irrigation and farming techniques illustrated by Child, without which the first permanent settlements could not have come to be. But it is striking that Göbekli Tepe is bereft of any sign of domestic habitation. They haven't found anything. Where did the workers sleep who were building the site? Where did they eat? Again, I turn to man's observations, within which he refers to Schmidt. Hundreds of people must have been required to carve and erect the pillars, but the site had no water source. The nearest stream was about 3 miles away. Those workers would have needed homes, but excavations have uncovered no sign of walls, hearths, or houses, no other buildings that Schmidt had interpreted as domestic. They would have had to be fed, but there is also no trace of agriculture. For that matter, Schmidt has found no mess kitchens or cooking fires. It was purely a ceremonial center. If anyone ever lived at this site, they were less its residents than its staff. This place, according to Schmidt, is the first man-made holy place. That's the inference that he's making. And I think that anachronistically, albeit anachronistically, because we know that the first cities had temples at their centers, that this is a pretty good assumption to make. The first man-made holy place that we've discovered. This bold statement contradicts assumptions that many archaeologists have worked with, namely that developments in agriculture that gave early people the time and food surpluses that they needed to build monuments helped them to develop a rich symbolic vocabulary, by which, of course, is meant religious belief systems. So first you had cities, and then religion follows. And then religion is, of course, cynically sometimes interpreted as a force of cohesion that's imposed by the ruling authorities on the people, and so on and so forth. That doesn't seem to be the case in light of Göbekli Tepe at all. I mean, as a Christian, I don't believe that's the case anyway, but here we have empirical evidence that contradicts the archaeologists, So anthropologists have further surmised that organized religion developed as a way of maintaining the cohesion between hunter-gatherers who had, in the Neolithic age, settled down. But in the case of Göbekli Tepe, which is, as far as we know, the world's first temple structure, worship seems to have been the catalyst for social cohesion. Worship as the catalyst for social cohesion. According to Schmidt, its T-shaped pillars, 2 of which are in the very center of the complex, have been erected to symbolically represent the anthropomorphic entities that they worshipped. Well, they're T-shaped pillars, so it looks like a torso and legs. It's not without merit. Supernatural beings, Schmidt called them, from another world. Extraterrestrials, I don't know, but yeah. Applying insights from Mircea Eliade, the vertical posture of these pillars, along with their circular placement, the circle is important because it reflects the firmament and the horizon, and of course, it finds its locus concretely in the sun and the moon. So they might have had these insights as well. The circular placement also has religious or symbolic significance. For it is not entirely self-evident that they should have been erected vertically or in a circle, unless there was some meaning behind doing that, right? Why not just scatter them haphazardly? They're in circles. This factor could have been that, generally speaking, ancient persons were motivated to dwell and worship in or near centralized locations where what Eliade called a hierophany, or a manifestation of the sacred, took place. This manifestation both revealed and connected the three general levels of reality: heaven, earth, and the underworld. We know that, I mean, we're strictly categorizing them here, but from the earliest, let's say, Mesopotamian texts and later Egyptian texts, in the historical record, we see that these levels of reality, celestial, terrestrial, and subterranean, however you want to name them, are believed in. So you can infer them backwards, I think, as well. So the manifestation of the hierophany revealed and connected the three general levels of reality, and thus would prompt human beings to actualize and facilitate this intersection of the three cosmic layers by erecting structures that symbolically connected or encompassed them. And this human response, Eliade argued, to where the sacred was manifested, and the concretization of a stairway to heaven, of a connection between heaven and earth, has to do with the desire to be closest to the fullness of being, which is prevalent amongst ancient religious traditions. The sacred dimension was reflected in the belief that heaven, comprising one of the three main tiers of the cosmos, was the abode of the gods or spiritual beings in particular. Eliade called the former intersecting objects, those that intersect heaven, earth, and the underworld, axis mundi, centers of the world, and the latter, those that encompassed or recapitulated or summarized these three cosmic layers, imagines mundi, or images of the world. So here's a close-up of one of Göbekli Tepe's T-shaped pillars depicting a fox. And here is the famous vulture pillar, the transverse bar on top of it in enclosure D, perhaps the world's oldest pictograph. The vulture is holding a ball there. What is it? We don't know. There's been a lot of speculation. Is it the sun? Is it a cosmic image? There have been attempts to connect Göbekli Tepe to celestial or astral constellations and cycles without much success. More than likely, the images of the animals on the site represent those animals that would have been prevalent in the area during certain seasons. So it would be seasonal, specifically divided into 6 months of the year, and so on and so forth. So the pillars of Göbekli Tepe can thus be interpreted as axis mundi, connecting at the very least the heavenly or celestial and earthly realms in their vertical orientation. And if they find further evidence, which I don't think they will, there's no written evidence about what some of the circular images are, and they can make an explicit connection to the cosmos, that would be awesome. I think the very fact of their vertical orientation already connects them to the cosmos. So what did I just read? Yeah, the pillars of Göbekli Tepe can thus be interpreted as axis mundi, connecting at the very least the heavenly or celestial and earthly realms in their vertical orientation. The circle is a cosmic symbol delineating the firmament's trajectory over the horizon and encompassing the four cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. Thus, their circular placement may be imitating the sky as an imago mundi that they might have identified with heaven, although we cannot know this for certain. In any case, both interpretations are in line with the etymology of the word symbolic that we saw above, means to throw together. Two hitherto disparate objects become inseparable. That's what Armstrong had written. That these pillars are covered with reliefs depicting a vast array of animals that could be part of a mythological cycle would also make them imagines mundi, reflecting the cosmos of the inhabitants, who weren't really inhabiting the space but were there to worship. Additionally, Schmidt has argued that these animals might be serving as apotropeia, the use of evil creatures to ward off evil. Again, that's extending the abundant evidence we have from Mesopotamia and Egypt. And I'm mentioning them only because they're the most ancient civilizations within this geographical region in the Mediterranean and the Levant, it just makes sense that some of these would be apotropeia, the use of mythological creatures based on reality, on zoomorphic imagery, to ward off chaotic entities associated with these animals and so on and so forth. It's clear to me. Whatever the case may be, Schmidt's theories have turned the assumptions of archaeologists and anthropologists on their head. Insofar as he believes that the construction of a massive temple by a group of foragers is evidence that organized religion, I'm quoting him here, could have come before the rise of agriculture and other aspects of civilization. It's consistent with Genesis, I'll tell you that much, This, of course, without taking it, the underlying truths reflected in Genesis, which are valid for Christians, yeah, definitely. This, of course, includes the city or metropolis, which in any case only begins to take shape in a way that is recognizable for modern Westerners with the ancient Greek polis or city-states around 800 BC. Certainly, Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that religion preceded villages and towns, that also predated cities in the way we have come to know them, which would have comprised domiciles organized around temples or religious structures for most of the population, peasants, farmers, tradesmen, etc. We shall now turn to the role of religious symbolism in the first cities as confirming, albeit anachronistically, our thesis that religion, expressed through symbols, preceded and is even a necessary condition for human settlement. Is the partially reconstructed Mesopotamian ziggurat of one of history's most ancient cities in modern-day Iraq. Obviously, this is what most of the inhabitants of the city would have seen and experienced as the center of the world, a cosmic mountain within which the rulers, as embodiments of the gods, dwelt. And the precinct of Amun-Ra in the temple of Karnak near Luxor, Egypt. Very similar perceptions happening there. The earliest cities then, which had sprung up in Mesopotamia and Egypt at the beginning of the Neolithic age, 3000 BC, owe their characteristic emphasis on religion to the religious impetus that gave birth to the first settlements. It was religion that preceded their construction and that maintained them via various means, including the building of, for example, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, step pyramids, and temples in Egypt that were the focal and dominant structures in their civic space. These structures were imagines et axis mundi, images and centers of the world, intersecting and encompassing the levels of the cosmos as the Mesopotamians and Egyptians described them in their myths. Beyond these two civilizations, we discern similar phenomena throughout the Near East and the Mediterranean, phenomena that continued through the Middle Ages and up to the dawn of modernity. And of course, in other parts of the world as well. But I can't demonstrate a direct link between ancient Mesopotamian ziggurats and Mesoamerican ziggurats, which come much later. I'm not going to even attempt that here. We're localized geographically. Thus, we can affirm that religious belief was the principal causal factor that influenced human beings to come together as communities, as opposed to an attempt to consolidate these communities after they'd come together for utilitarian or cynical reasons. This means that human settlement was organized around and thus conditioned by sacred symbols. Above, we saw that according to Armstrong and Eliade, all pre-modern societies, archaic, ancient, and medieval, were able to symbolically discern in mundane objects, whether natural or human-made, a hierophany or manifestation of the sacred, which for Eliade was the manifestation of something of a wholly different order, a reality that does not belong to our world, in objects that are an integral part of our natural, profane, he puts in inverted commas, world. We also saw that what Eliade would have described as a human being's response to a hierophany, that is the construction of objects made to encompass and facilitate participation in the sacredness that intersected all of reality, cosmic tears. Here it is important to affirm that these human-made axis mundi and imagines mundi, such as Mesopotamian ziggurats that were made to look like cosmogonic mountains, or Egyptian temples that recapitulated their vision of the cosmos, were usually always based on natural objects, such as mountains already mentioned, gardens, trees, and vines, to name a few, that were primarily and in an anterior manner, conduits for this manifestation of the sacred. So you've got the sacred tree that you worship at. It's lost to history, it gets knocked down. You create a symbolic material reconstruction of that tree and worship there, so on and so forth. Or at a particular time, the Nile River is full of fecundity and growth, and it manifests the sacred. So you build your temple in such a way that its interior reflects that time of the year, both in terms of the constellations that are depicted on the underside of the roof, and also the lushness of the Nile, which is depicted on the ground level, so on and so forth. According to Eliade, ancient, medieval, and early modern peoples experienced a dialectic tension between sacred and profane existence. The hierophany was always sought after. It was immutable, changeless, and divine, a key to the fecundity of being inaugurated by God or the gods illo tempore, comparable to what Armstrong later called the timeless world of everywhere. Moreover, the locus of the hierophany, the object that revealed the sacred, that both imbued and transcended it, consecrated that point as a center of the world insofar as revealed the fixed point, the central axis for all future orientation. Such objects can only be at the very center of the universe, for the whole of the habitable world extends around them. They would eventually be discerned in the distinctive structures that constituted the symbolic centers of settlements and later cities up to the dawn of modernity. And beyond ziggurats and temples also included palaces, monuments, and churches. You could say, you can assume this in relation to the temple in Jerusalem, to the Holy Sepulchre and Golgotha. You can, it's the same perception, of course, with the big difference that it's the Trinitarian God who's manifested in the Christian spaces through Christ, okay? While ancient and medieval settlements and cities were indeed loci of hierophanies within which the whole of the cosmos could be participated in, nevertheless, the city also needed, paradoxically, to be actively cosmicized through symbolic rituals. This was necessary because, according to Armstrong, who went on to analyze hierophanies from the Neolithic period to the early Bronze Age, so 3300 to 1200 BC, in the cities, the rate of change accelerated, and people became more aware of the chain of cause and effect. The new technology gave city dwellers a more complete control over their environment, and they were becoming increasingly more distinct from the natural world. Within cities, the chaotic flux of events and the distinction from nature became difficult to bear, and Dean A. Miller highlighted the consequences of the dissociation between nature and human beings that took place with the rise of the first cities. The city, whatever it is, from the first is not merely a more complex, oversized village. Man, again, this was written in the 1970, I think, so excuse the non-inclusive language. Man raised and moved into a multiplex structure that immediately began to pose psychic problems and take a physical toll, at the same time that it optimized his production of goods and freed his mind from certain old controls. There is original sin here, the sin of isolation, of differentiation. He's picking up on Babel themes from Genesis, of the appearance of the mental attitude that separates subject and object, man from his physically nutritive environment once extensive with him. The dissociation between human beings and nature, between the subject and its coextensive object, that resulted from the chaotic flux of early city life had to be addressed, and this was done precisely via the organization of settlements around temple structures that symbolically repeated in architectonic form and through the rituals that took place within them, the cosmogony or creation of the natural world, which we have through which we have seen the sacred was revealed. In Christianity, the intersection between heaven and earth in the narrative of Christ's life, framed cosmically, was depicted in churches. And there's a despoiling of the kind of idolatry associated with the worship of gods that embodied human behaviors and that were anthropozoomorphic and that exacerbated the passions. That's more or less it's more or less overcome in Christendom, although you have exaggerations in certain contexts. So moreover, since the god or the gods were believed to have created the world, then the cosmogony could be considered the first great hierophany illo tempore at the beginning, and this is what people participated in when they erected their temples or churches in the topographical and symbolic centers of their cities. So to conclude, this paper has demonstrated via the use of Eliadean conceptual categories, which were deployed in recent years by Karen Armstrong and others, David Doran, etc. Eliade is big in fashion these days with Jordan Peterson using his insights and others, that Göbekli Tepe is an important religious site. Its symbolic imagery and arrangement shows that religion was a principal motivating factor for human beings to come together in Neolithic times, at least in this specific place. While we know about the dominance of religion in the first cities in history, in Mesopotamia and Egypt and elsewhere, nevertheless, with Göbekli Tepe, we can discern the significance of religion even before the earliest human settlements. Religion, expressed through symbolic structures, in this case, limestone megaliths that were adorned with various zoomorphic images and anthropomorphic in their shape, that functioned as imagines et axis mundi. Religion was thus a motivating factor for human beings to establish their communities. This process, however, was paradoxically hastened in the city space. This is because of the rupture in this space between human beings and their coextensive natural environment, which they believed revealed the sacred. In response to this, it became even more important to recapitulate, again through religious symbols, the natural world, the cosmos, as it was originally envisaged in ancient myths, or any manifestation of the divine in history. We see this in ancient civilizations in the Near East and Mediterranean, and it continues, albeit in a different Christianized form, and there are major differences. I want to underline that, but I addressed them in the last presentation that I gave for this seminar, in the Middle Ages, in Christendom and beyond. Could we perhaps infer that the beginnings of this cosmosizing process can be discerned as a seedling in chronologically distinct Göbekli Tepe? Were the creators of this site, of whom we know very little, attempting to recreate a sacred natural environment that they had been separated from? These are questions that we may perhaps never have a complete answer for, but none of that detracts from the religious and symbolic significance of this site. That's it.
Thanks, Maura. I've never heard of this site, but it's fascinating. Yeah, it's amazing that it hasn't gained as much notoriety as you know, some of the other sites ancient sites you've mentioned. Well, why don't we open it up to some Q&A? So if anyone here in person wants to start, yeah, Dave. And sorry, our camera keeps freezing up.
Thanks, Mario. That was great. I found that really interesting, and I love reading about some of this sort of stuff as a hobby, I suppose you'd say. The claim I think you made sort of halfway through, or kind of throughout, I suppose, that religion is a necessary precondition of human settlement. I wasn't quite clear on that link. Like I got that it was before, that religion has come before human settlement, but it seems like it's a stronger claim to say that it's a necessary precondition. And so, like, I guess my question is, like, can you just explain that again if you've already sort of done it? I didn't quite get the link. The second thought I had was, like, in all the different cities that they've looked at in the ancient world, do they all have religion at its center? And I presume that there's earlier settlements that aren't quite maybe cities that maybe don't have religion at their center, but maybe I'm wrong about all that.
No, these are good observations and questions, and you know, depending on the scholar, you'll get a different take. I presumed or took for granted some basic assumptions at the very beginning of the paper, which is that religion and human consciousness coincide. And that's something that scholars like Eliade will affirm as a pretext for any analysis of archaic persons onwards, even up to modernity. He'll argue that, you know, the process of reading a novel because it suspends the unfolding of the profane duration of time and space is a religious experience because you transport yourself elsewhere. And that's what they were doing with these ceremonies thousands of years ago, right? So you can argue that basically anything and everything is religious. By necessary precursor, I think that the attempts at social cohesion, which we see manifested in the very first cities, so as distinct from Neanderthal villages, whatever they were hunter-gatherers, so they didn't have permanent settlements. But whatever permanent, let's say, interment of their bodies might reveal, the first villages emerge around about 5,000 years ago, maybe a little bit before that. And what we do discern with them is a temple in their center. So religion is there. It's there in all of the earliest, what we would describe as cities in the geographical context that I addressed, the Near East, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. Throughout Egypt, throughout Mesopotamia, throughout Greece, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, it's absolutely ubiquitous. The further back you go, because of the loss of the historical record, writing goes back only 7,000 years. And some of the writing that goes in cuneiform is pretty mundane. It's like a list of chickens that someone might own. It's not necessarily about profound topics, but the arrangement of the deceased in various graves and so on and so forth, even before the very first cities, makes people infer that there's some kind of a ritual happening here, the painting of red ochre on bodies or something like that, which points towards patterns of behavior that look explicitly religious later on. These are repeated gestures, they are organized gestures, they are meant to evoke something other than the face value event that's taken place. So religion as a necessary precursor, yes, because it was there beforehand. What else would have driven these people to, these hunter-gatherers, 10,000 BC, to erect what looks like symbolic religious structures in the middle of nowhere with no urban settlement nearby? Anachronistically, it looks like the only motivating factor is some kind of communal worship. Because there's no evidence for anything practical happening there. Like we make a settlement and a city because we want to live there, we want the view, we want proximity to work, we want the utilities, we want to be able to have running plumbing and so on and so forth. Nothing like that in Göbekli Tepe, nothing. So I don't know if that covers both questions. The ubiquity of temples in the... Jan Assmann, who passed away a few years ago, the great historian of ancient Egyptian religions and temples, said there is no characteristic town or city in ancient Egypt apart from a temple. It's always going to be a temple at the center. And the same can be said about these Mesopotamian ziggurats, these step pyramids. You know, now whether or not that religiosity was always good is another question. I mean, if you look at what happens in Mesopotamia, and especially later with the Babylonians in the same region, you know, there's a good reason why the film The Exorcist begins with that idol of Pazuzu being dug out of the... But where's Bernard? He's the expert on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Like, I just wonder if there's still a possibility that you could have these centers of ritual that develop apart from human settlement, and then human settlements that develop somewhere else, and then eventually they kind of, you know...
We don't have evidence. We don't have evidence. So that's a fair assumption. But if Göbekli Tepe is the first temple that we find, and then there's a jump forward in time to the first cities, what's common is some kind of religious looking thing. There's all the other, there might have been settlements, but the materials they were made out of might have decayed through time. Yeah. So it is an open question. I'm forcefully arguing for something that I think is consistent with human beings being created in the Imago Dei and all these sorts of things, you know. But yeah, I hope that helped.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, great. Thanks. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, questions?
You say that it's in the middle of nowhere. Is there any kind of I don't know, religious reason for the geography being chosen.
That's another good observation. Lots of conjecture about why this particular spot, but no definitive answers. And I can't give you a definitive one now. Is it because of the certain kinds of animals that are depicted on these limestone pillars being prevalent in this area? Were they farming them at certain times of the year, and so they would come back to this area often? We have this cosmic imagery on the pillars, but we cannot, we as in experts, I'm not an expert on this topic, archaeologists cannot conclusively demonstrate the connection between the circles and other images on these pillars and the constellations, for example. So it might have been that during a certain time of the year, the stars were aligned in a certain way, which reflected, I don't know, looked like a particular deity, and they came to that spot in order to, I mean, that we know that from Egypt, and we know that from Mesopotamia, more so from Egypt, with the alignment of the constellations, with the shafts that intersect the Great Pyramid of Giza, and so on and so forth. But we just don't know in relation to Göbekli Tepe. And it's a very popular topic. There's a show on Netflix, Ancient Apocalypses, which addresses this.
Yeah,
Controversially, yeah. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I thought it's fascinating, like the connection between the constellations and the potential for an ancient civilization to be warning us, a future civilization, of a impending, I don't know, meteorite or something like that. Wasn't that the argument?
That was the argument, and it's been very controversial. This guy Gordon, I don't remember his surname. He appeared on all sorts of podcasts afterwards promoting his ideas, and had vigorous debates with scholars who said, you're basically getting Nostradamus and applying him to ancient archaeology. It's very interesting. Makes for good TV.
Yeah, I did. It's great.
Yeah. That's right.
I've got a question. Are you familiar with Jacques Ellul, the 20th century sociologist, kind of lay theologian? He's got a book called Meaning of the City, which I haven't actually read.
Oh, I've got that one. Yeah.
Okay. Well, what do you take? Have you read it?
I've looked at bits of it. He's got a very pessimistic view of the city.
In some ways, I think he could be read as doing the opposite of what you're doing, but it depends, I think, a lot on what you mean by religion. Because for him, the city epitomizes man's work in rebellion against God. And but again, I haven't actually read Meaning of the City, but he traces the kind of figure of the city throughout Scripture. And obviously, Revelation ends in a city, a garden city. But I think for him, that's God's gracious accommodation and redemption of human work.
Yeah. Look, I mean.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was curious if you were aware of his work, and if so, what you thought of it. Again, I think in some sense he's kind of the opposite of what you're saying, but if religion is actually, humanity's attempts at achieving or conjuring its own sort of access to a divine level on the basis of its own work, then you and he are on the same page. But
well, I mean, I think he's brilliant, and I think that definitely, in terms of the scriptural testimony, you have a paradox in relation to the city, because the city emerges after the exile from Eden, so after the fall. And if we take the paradise narrative as representing an underlying reality concerning the human being's relationship with God, and that prideful disobedience culminating in original sin and death, leading us away from God, then these marked human beings, let's say, exiled from Eden, their first act after the having children and the rebellion of Cain against Abel and the murder of Abel, I think it's one of Cain's descendants who then builds the first city, and then you have Babel. So it doesn't look good in relation to anything done by human beings' own initiative. It all looks like an affront to God. But then providentially speaking, even within our prideful disobedience and self-centeredness, God works. And so Jesus, even though it'll end in his, again, it's paradoxical, his redeeming death and resurrection, his face is always turned towards Jerusalem. In Luke's gospel, we see that written again and again. He uses city imagery to describe himself as the chief cornerstone of the temple, which was the dominant feature of ancient Jerusalem, so on and so forth. And then you have this nuance again coming through the epistles, which is very obvious. We have no lasting city. Our city is in heaven. That's the final destination of Christians. At the same time, they need to work within the world, which is full of cities. And the main one at the time, Peter describes as the church in Babylon gives greetings. So that's Rome, the Roman Empire. Then, afterwards, Rome is Christianized. And then that's the double-edged sword again. People are exposed to Christianity en masse, right, within this city space. And other cities are Christianized. And yet within the city, that's where the state works, and that's where corruption is. And it's just all tied together until the final, let's say, initiative of God to reestablish the Edenic situation with everything good that man has done in relation to the city, that kind of garden city that we see descending from heaven in the book of Revelation. So these things are very complex. And I think that, given the fact that we spoke about human beings' dissociation from nature in the city space and how they were desperate in ancient times to reclaim that closeness with nature by simply painting natural themes within their temples. And we see that continuing to a large extent within the Middle Ages as well. The modern city is worse from this point of view in terms of the dissociation between human beings and nature, because it doesn't really try to recapitulate nature even from an artistic or architectural point of view until recently with the whole green building movement. This disjunction between us and nature, reflected in the way that we live in cities, can have a detrimental effect on our well-being. I mean, what's the first thing that we want to do? Get away from the city and go into nature, because that's where we ontologically belong to a large extent, right? And I was just contemplating the role of information and communication technology, smartphones, devices, generative AI. That's a further step away from the natural world as well. So we're in cities that are away from the natural world, but then we are reflexively attached to objects that continue to move us away from God's creation. And so there are a lot of let's say springboards that this topic can go in. I think the insights from Göbekli Tepe are really interesting for the contemporary civic enterprise, to be honest with you.
Sorry, I had another question. In all the kind of these early temples or places of worship, is there always some, there's always symbol, there's always writing or pictures of animals, always? Is that?
Seems to be the case. I don't know if we have a lot of evidence from Mesopotamia. There were probably idols within their temples. We have lots of evidence from Egypt, which is it's near contemporaneous, 500 years after the Mesopotamian cities.
Right, so there's kind of writing and temple. So I'm now, because you said Christ is the cornerstone of the temple, like, the temple, the city, like the kind of concept that the word is always associated with, like wordedness is always associated with a place of, worship, even in these early ones. He's like, where my brain is gone. Yeah.
That's nothing comes out of a vacuum. That's a good observation. Yes, that's the case. And you have the earliest cuneiform inscriptions, which are like chicken feet, but then you get eventually hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt, which are pictograms. They're pictures of things, animals, humans, combined in various ways, scarab beetles and various other things.
Yeah, because it's fascinating that it's not just enough to carve the rocks. I mean, I remember going into France, into some of the, like, I don't know what era it's from, but 30,000 years ago, where they're They're,
Lascaux paintings.
yeah. So the cave painting
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And it's like, it's not enough just to be there carving things or whatever, or in Malta as well. They have to imprint a communication, which I find fascinating, like either, a picture or a hand. So there's always seems to be language associated with these places, or words.
Yeah, and we've lost their songs and whatever it was that they were uttering or enunciating. We it's just lost the history. We don't know. It's a very fascinating topic.
It is. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I think Josh had a question.
Yeah. I'm curious, or sort of interested in the use of Eliade, or I hope I'm pronouncing that guy's name right. Obviously I'm not an expert on this, but I have sort of interacted with it. He's obviously a titan in the field of comparative religion. But with that, he's also attracted a fair bit of criticism. And I'm particularly thinking of Jonathan Z. Smith's book, To Take Place. So like Eliade's theory, as far as I understand it, is largely built on Mesopotamian texts that are significantly later than the site you're talking about in Göbekli Tepe. Arguably, like Jonathan Z. Smith argues that Eliade's reading of those Mesopotamian texts is not very strong, and Eliade then has a tendency to take that axis mundi, center of the world, sort of archetype, and apply it in places that it probably doesn't belong. And so I'm not saying that like the center never holds as a theory, but I am interested as to whether I feel like the case needs to be made. We can't just assume that this particular ancient culture is, working under this sort of center periphery model, or this axis of connection between a three-tiered symbolic universe, especially given the criticism of Eliade's work. So I'm curious as to whether you've sort of engaged with that.
Oh no, I have. The earliest Mesopotamian fragments that we have are probably from around the mid 2nd millennium BC, so 1600 years before Christ. We have earlier stuff in Egypt, right? Because it's there on the walls of the temples and so on and so forth. So a stronger case can be made in relation to Egypt. Why he prioritizes Mesopotamia? It's because according to the Babylonian thesis that was prevalent in the mid-20th century, and it still stands because these ziggurats are ancient, are very ancient, and that's been demonstrated with carbon dating and all these sorts of things, right? Is that the commonalities between the two can make you infer that these are long-standing beliefs. So part of the reason I don't have a problem with the written evidence in relation to Mesopotamia coming later is based partly on the Pan-Babylonian thesis that kind of everything emerges there in terms of civilization. And for civilization to emerge, you need to have a worldview. And the commonalities in relation to the worldview of the Mesopotamians and any adjacent civilization for which we have older material are very easily demonstrable. And there was another thing that I factored in, which just left my mind. Let me just gather my thoughts for a second. They're easily demonstrable. I think that's basically why I happen to take it for granted. I think Eliade answered challenges to his own works in some of his later writings as well. Yeah, I don't particularly see a problem with it. Oh, yeah, the other reason, here it is because of the, let's say, prevalence in these ancient civilizations to pass things down, not necessarily in written form, but orally. So this is not only true necessarily of indigenous persons in civilizations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, for example, Native American Indians, and so on and so forth. It's ubiquitous. It's absolutely everywhere. Before the written record, human beings were passing down information integrally, more or less. But do you get what I mean? With exaggerations, but nevertheless, there's a through line that we presume is the case, for example, in relation to the Old Testament. We know that some of the material that was compiled in the 10th century, let's say, and underwent a period of redaction for 500 years from the Davidic period onwards is much older, but we don't have textual evidence for how old it is, okay? The Genesis narrative, the books of Moses, and so on and so forth. Why should it be any different for Mesopotamia or Egypt? They have so many commonalities, these civilizations. It's the same with Homer's Iliad. We know that the Iliad and the Odyssey were ascribed to memory and recited for centuries before they were written down or compiled and redacted by whoever the blind bard from Chios, Homer, is. So, yeah, Eliade gets a lot of flack because it partly has to do with his very positive spin on religion, and secular scholars don't like it, so they come at him with a hammer. I think that's the best I can do to try to answer why I think his method is still valid. But it's a very good question and observation.
Maybe time for one more question. Oh no, Dave, you started. Yeah, you put up the last question.
I can ask a question if there's time. If there's no time, I'm happy to.
Not that we got time, but you'll be the last one.
Oh.
So it better be good.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's good. But I was actually just yeah. You touched on the Neanderthals, and would you say that Neanderthal consciousness is marked by religiosity?
Yeah, must have been, but I don't know what that would have looked like or meant.
Yeah.
Because we know that they symbolically arrange their dead. I mean, that's demonstrable in the use of the kind of minerals that they put on there, and the way that they bury them in kind of fetal positions and so on and so forth. I'm not an expert on this, I'm not. But the reading that I've done, Karen Armstrong, she's pretty good, and she's not a specialist archaeologist, but she's a pretty good theologian and historian, you know, and she's made this claim that they were religious. Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Does that have implications for how we think of what it means to be human? Do you think?
It might do, but my reading of the Genesis narrative and the creation of Adam and Eve in God's image, there are three ways usually, because if we're going to talk about anthropology, I presuppose Christian anthropology, right? So Adam and Eve are taken three ways or interpreted three ways traditionally, either as literal human beings who lived chronologically 6,000 years ago, or as the first human beings to experience God in a direct way and then fall, which I subscribe to. And that means that they were literal, but it doesn't have to be like the world is created in 6 days and they're put in the garden, that kind of a chronological facsimile. It's something that's lost to us, but the relevant things have come down. And Adam and Eve are exemplars for all of us. So if Adam and Eve were the first two human beings to experience God in a direct way and to fall, and if they were also, the message has been transmitted to us because it's relevant to our own experience of God and falling away, then that is not necessarily something that I think bears too much on when and where and how they were as Homo sapiens, or do you know what I mean? So does it have implications for the Neanderthals? I don't know. There's a tradition, of course, that with Christ's death on the cross and his descent into Hades, that he witnessed to everybody who had fallen asleep before him. Yeah. Who does that include? I don't know. That's a speculation. That's a total speculation. Who does it include? Well, you know, if they were innocent to the kind of, but are they or not? We don't know. It's beyond the realm of theological inquiry, I think. We can only speculate, you know. I'd like to think that God is more merciful than not, but
I hope so.
Neanderthals in heaven. Why not? You know, like I've got no problem with that. You know.
Well, I think we're part Neanderthal, aren't we? Yeah. Some of the.
Yeah. There's some genetic Yep, commonality, definitely.
There's always to be continued. So Mario, thanks again for sharing your time and insight with us, and it's always a treat, always stimulating, and so we'll look forward to next time.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, everyone go well for the rest of your Wednesday. And be in touch for next month.
Thank
October.
you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thank you.